What you'll notice, certainly today in the gospel and the next two Sundays, and for I think it's the first 3 Sundays of Advent, in some way all of the gospels talk about preparation. And in Advent especially, they talk about the second coming of Christ. You remember after communion, I don't know why they dropped it, but we would say Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. In explanation of this parable in terms of preparation, in Israel, when a young man and young woman would marry, what he would do is the young man would go and talk with the father of the girl he wanted to marry and ask the father for her hand. And they would make preparations, kind of, but she still would go and live in the home of her parents for a year. And at the end of the year, what would happen was the bridegroom would go back to her parents and they would negotiate some more. And so oftentimes it was not just a matter of him going and getting her, it was a matter of him going and renegotiate. How big a dowry was she bringing? Would that be enough to seal the deal, so to speak, for them? And other things that they would haggle over before she was released. And that's the point of the 10 virgins waiting. And that's the point why the 5 wise ones brought extra oil. They were prepared, where the 5 foolish ones didn't bring extra oil, and they said to the 5 smart ones, wise ones, they said, give us some of yours so that we can greet the groom when he comes with his new bride. And they said, nah, because what may happen is none of us will have any. So go to they call it in the gospel, the dealer, and get yourself some. And while they're going to do that, the bride and groom come and they lock themselves in the house so the other ones, the foolish virgins, can't get in. But then what happens is, in every town, they would celebrate the marriage of a young man and a woman for about 3 or 4 days. And they would be like the king and queen of the town. Their smallest need was addressed and fulfilled. And so, as I say, it was the village's way of saying this is something very important. But in the case of the virgins, there were 5 who had prepared very well, but 5 who didn't. And the 5 who didn't couldn't get into the celebration, precisely because they weren't prepared. It's a message, as I say, about preparation. The early church initially thought, especially in the letter to the Thessalonians, they thought that Christ was going to come very soon. And as a matter of fact, in St. Paul, in one of his letters to the Thessalonians, he had to tell them, some of you stop working because you say, well, Christ is coming again. We don't know when he's coming. And it seems initially, that Christ thought he was coming again very soon. Although he said, we got to keep working. We can't just give up work and presuming that he's going to come very soon. And so all of them then, they were preparing, but they went back to work. And you know, when you think about it, there's probably a little bit of us, of the foolish virgins in all of us. Things that maybe we weren't prepared for, or things that we should have known better, and we didn't. Maybe insurances that we should have bought, or things that we should have done that we simply didn't do. And it was because of our lack of preparation. 9/11, they said we should have seen that coming because all the different offices in our government, they knew about these people, but they didn't give each other information. And that's why they got away with this super tragedy. And so maybe part of the ignorance, if you wish, is the fact, in your case and mine, maybe it's somebody we should have contacted, and we find out they have died and we feel terrible. Or somebody, maybe just a phone call or a note to them. Aren't you and I like at times, aren't we like the foolish virgins? Some think that in this gospel, Matthew is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Matthew wrote his gospel probably after that happened. Matthew probably wrote his gospel anywhere from 75 or 80 to 90. And so Jerusalem had been destroyed. And so what he's talking about they destroyed it because not only were we not prepared for that, but because we had people in our society who worked against the Romans, and finally the Romans just got fed up with it and they destroyed everything. They leveled it. That's why today Jewish people, there's no temples. If they call them a temple, they know it isn't a temple. It's a house of worship, but not the temple. The temple would only be in Jerusalem. The second reading, it's not very often that this happens, but the second reading and the gospel dovetail. The second reading, the first letter to St. Paul to the to the Thessalonians, was the first document written in the New Testament, probably written sometime in the early 50s. And one of the things that happened was, any place that St. Paul would go in and evangelize, sometimes that community would have questions that they wanted to ask him. And so what happens is, in Thessalonica, the weather was like we've been having, thank God, the last few days, very agreeable. The weather was very mild, and so what happened is you had the native Thessalonians and even Roman soldiers who had been stationed there. They came back because they liked it so well. It was much more mild than was the weather in Rome, and so they came back and settled in Thessalonica. But the problem was, they had this little community that St. Paul had founded, and they really, what they wanted to know was, what about this? What happens when we die? These people, their philosophy or their theology was, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. There's nothing after this. And so what they ask, and St. Paul responds to them, do not grieve as those who don't have hope. Meaning, St. Augustine says that what St. Paul said was, he's not telling them not to grieve, because even Jesus himself, we read at the grave of Lazarus, St. Luke writes, and Jesus wept. It's the smallest phrase in the Gospels. And Jesus wept when he came to the grave of his friend Lazarus. And so it is with us. St. Augustine says, he says, the reading in one says, do not grieve as those without hope. In other words, grieve all right. Jesus grieved for Lazarus, even when he knew what he was going to do. You can grieve, that's normal, and you ought to. But he says, just know, as the old African-American spiritual says, someday we'll be together. I think Diana Ross and the Supremes, they made a record out of it. I think it was a gold record. But that's taken from an old African-American spiritual. Someday we'll be together. I forget the lyrics. Some sweet day we'll be together. In other words, they're looking forward to that when the world will end, as it does, probably for almost maybe all of us. The world will end when you and I close our eyes in death. You know, one of the things that people who've had near-death experiences share is they share the fact that when you have a near-death experience, it's extraordinarily peaceful, extraordinarily tranquil, no more troubles, no more worries about inflation or violence, No more worries about anything. And the reason why it's so good, again, quoting St. Augustine, is because it's the eternal now. There is no before, no after. And so the amount of joy and happiness we get when our world comes to an end, that's why it never ends. Because we always stay in the eternal now. And that's why, for example, in our funeral liturgy, the priest, the coffin are vested in white vestments and a white pall. White is the symbol of hope. And that's when we die, that's what we believe. You are, and so am I, we're hopeful that our loved one indeed rests in peace. And as I say, without any problems that you and I will face in this world, they're past that now. And that's what St. Paul is telling them. Grieve, okay, but grieve with hope. Know that they have a far better life than we do. He still says grieve. It's not easy to lose anybody. But in this gospel, it says, always be prepared. You know not the day nor the hour. And so, within the last couple of weeks here in the parish, we lost a baby who was 2 months old. We lost a young man who was 25 years old. And we lost a lady who was 101. You know not the day nor the hour. We don't. Today could be my last day. Could be any of yours. We just don't know. And so what the gospel really implies, I think, it implies live every day as though it were your last. Someday it will be. Amen.